curious, if you were sitting in your old seat at either SoFi or Brex, what would convince you that blockchain-based infrastructure was ready for prime time? And do you believe that it is ready today, and it's really more of a discovery process for the folks that are out there in the institutional realm?
I think ultimately, if I zoom out and kind of try to place myself in a different company, I would say, what does blockchain really do that doesn't already happen today? Why do we need this technology? Is this a technology looking for a problem? Is it a solution looking for a problem? That's probably what I might think. But being specific about Brex, which is a corporate credit card, if someone had said to me when we were starting that company, there's a capital markets rail, an automated underwriting and capital market that comes together, that's on blockchain, that all you have to do is integrate that, and then you can focus on innovation, product experience, marketing, I would have been interested. And I think that if you kind of look at fintech, there's and let's just use the Brex example. There's Brex, there's Ramp, there's Navan, there's Bill.com. All these people are coming up with their own ways of offering a corporate credit card, and they're building out warehouse lines and capital markets. And ultimately, that's pretty inefficient because none of the people that are choosing those products are choosing them because of that reason. They're choosing the software, they're choosing the marketing, they're choosing the brand, they're choosing the rewards. And none of that really ties to that huge amount of financial and underwriting infrastructure that they require. And so I think if something like Figure existed for Brex at the time, we would have been very interested. So that's my rebuttal. That's my rebuttal to myself. That's my skeptical self.
Yes, your rebuttal counterfactual. So you obviously spend a lot of time with major banks, asset managers, regulators, a wide swath of constituencies that really touch the traditional financial markets in different ways. For you, what's the most telling question that comes from that constituency that separates the folks that you would describe as understanding and getting it, and those that still don't?
Yeah, I think blockchain more broadly would be, what's the difference between this and a database? And I think that's because in some ways there isn't that much of a difference, right? Like blockchain is a form of a database. The point is around the permissions and the validation and the mutability and the decentralization of it all. So it's not that the functionality itself is similar, right? But it's the fact that the permissions and the way data moves and the validation and the decentralization of all that I think is valuable. And so I think it's, when you're asking that question, I think it just implies that you're kind of taking a more narrow view. And if you look at technology more broadly, you could ask a similar question about lots of technologies. Like you could say, just using some very basic examples, but like an iPhone is still a phone, right? And so just because it's not like, I just want to call someone, sure, right? Like my point being is like, yes, it stores information, but I think that at least in the context of what Figure does, and you're starting to see this today, I don't know if you've seen any of this, Alex, but there's a lot of issues around double pledging loans, this tricolor bankruptcy. You're sort of seeing a lot of counterfactuals to what happens when you don't use Figure or a version of Figure in the Provenance blockchain. And I think that that's a perfect example. Like that information could have been, so just to give context to the listeners, this is a bankruptcy tied to the fact that loans were double pledged to multiple people. And those loans could have existed in a database, but the fact is that database was wrong, right? So it's not about whether or not it's like, yes, there is some functionality of a database, but it's also about the smart contracts and the permissioning, as we've talked about, and the immutability of the data that goes into that database that really moves the needle.
No, it's a great call out, and it really is, an example of, there's not just sort of broader sort of risk controls, right, that are required to get things right in the capital markets. There's also just operational hygiene that sometimes gets missed, to your point, Michael. And again, blockchain creates a really great solution to cleaning up and really like negating the need to even have some of those operations at all. One question I wanted to ask you was around sort of legacy assumptions in finance. Do you see any legacy assumptions in finance that need to, in some ways, go the way of the dodo in order for blockchain-based markets to truly thrive?
I think that there's an assumption that a lot of industry participants have, which is that let's just use underwriting as an example. I think people look at years of experience and judgment and think when you're doing something like underwriting, and I'm assessing someone on that basis, it's like, how many years of experience do they have? Where did they work previously? There's a lot of these, call it tangential things that influence whether someone views that position as an example. And the reality is a model-based approach to underwriting makes a lot more sense than looking at someone's years of experience or where they worked previously, which don't directly correlate with their ability to underwrite. And so I think that's kind of a microcosm of a lot of things in financial services, underwriting being very big and obvious, where Figure takes a different approach, right? We underwrite based on bank account cash flows and to a specific model, and that's auditable and can be put on a blockchain. You can't put somebody's taste and preferences on a blockchain, but you can say, this is how we underwrite, this is our approach. And I think more of that standardization is valuable. And you'd think that would be very obvious, but there's a lot of just legacy assumptions and processes that make people focus on things like years of underwriting experience. And from that, you sort of see it's not about getting more and more detailed on the underwriting experience of that person. It's about actually asking the question, why are we even doing it this way?